darle las gracias por estar acá. Ya hay 5 alumnos titulados nuestro doctorado, un programa de verdad increíble que nos tiene muy orgullosos, especialmente por el nivel de las personas que hemos convocado. Y 3 vinieron de otros países, y uno fue Marcelo Santos, está su directora de tesis acá, paulista, que hizo su tesis sobre las redes y la crisis política brasileña. Y gracias a él está hoy día Axel Bruns con nosotros, este profesor de origen alemán, que va a ser presentado por Rayen, que ha hecho su carrera académica en Australia. Como facultad nos parece clave estar en contacto con lo que se está entendiendo en estos espacios. Hemos traído a Martin Hilbert, Christian Weppe, Katz, ahora Bruns. Son nuestros socios en estos proyectos en los cuales los queremos invitar a todos ustedes a participar en este proceso. Hasta hace poco éramos una facultad que nos dedicábamos a los medios y hoy nos referimos a comunicaciones, a conversaciones. Y las redes, de las cuales tanto sabe nuestro invitado, nos permiten oír, como también expresarnos y llegar a miles de personas sin necesidad de medios. Como facultad, quiero darle especialmente las gracias a Axel. Aprovecho a agradecer de nuevo a Marcelo, que lo estaba aludiendo sin tenerlo presente, y confirmar ante todos ustedes lo que le dije pasado jueves, que esta es su casa y que nos gustaría mucho que nos ayudara a nosotros y a todos ustedes a seguir entendiendo lo que viene. Muchísimas gracias. Rayen, por favor.
Gracias, Eduardo. Gracias a todos por estar presentes esta mañana. Thank you so much, Professor Bruns, to be here today with us. Voy a hacer la introducción en español y de manera muy breve. Si ustedes necesitan el CV del profesor Bruns, que realmente es muy prolífico, muy largo, no duden en pedírnoslo, se los podemos enviar. Pero básicamente quisiera, antes de presentarlo, agradecer hoy día a CONICYT. CONICYT hizo posible, a través de la beca que se ganó el doctor Marcelo Santos, que él conociera al profesor Axel Bruns, que fuese a hacer una estadía a la Queensland University of Technology de Australia, que es de donde viene nuestro profesor, y también agradecer a la Vicerrectoría de Investigación y al Colegio de Programas Doctorales, que financió en parte la estadía del profesor Bruns esta semana acá. Sobre el profesor y sobre el libro que él nos va a hablar esta mañana, quisiera decir que él es profesor de la Facultad de Industrias Creativas de esta universidad, es profesor de Medios y de Comunicación del Centro de Investigación en Medios Digitales de la Universidad de Queensland of Technology, que es autor de más de 20, 30 diferentes artículos, capítulos de libros, y que recientemente ha sido honrado con uno de los importantes proyectos de su país, de llegada, puesto que, como decía nuestro decano, él es alemán de origen, pero hizo su doctorado en medios y estudios culturales en Australia. Ha sido honrado, como les digo, con un proyecto muy relevante que tiene que ver con la contribución de los académicos a la discusión social y a la contribución social. Es un gran proyecto financiado por 3 años, y él tiene una unidad de investigación propia en Australia en este momento por eso, pero además se ha distinguido mucho por trabajar en el área de cómo innovar en metodologías para estudiar las redes sociales, no solo en el área del periodismo, como hoy día se va a centrar, pero en muchas otras áreas. Tiene una experiencia interdisciplinaria también muy interesante, y es una persona que está promoviendo que el estudio de las redes sociales se haga también de manera no solo cuantitativa, en el estilo del Big Data, como se suele conocer, sino cómo podemos avanzar en metodologías que nos hagan comprender mejor estos fenómenos y dinámicas sociales desde lo cualitativo. Así que, sin más, quisiera dejar al profesor Bruns con ustedes.
Right, well, thank you very much for your kind welcome and for the invitation to be here in the first place. Thank you all. And thank you particularly, Marcelo, for making the connection and really bringing me here ultimately, particularly also for your PhD defense, and congratulations again on that as well. This talk will largely cover what I've published in this new book, Gatewathcing and News Curation, which really deals with the questions that journalism is facing in this age of social media, in the present context. Yeah, I hope it will be of interest. From what I've seen already over the last week or so that I've been here, there are clearly a lot of points of connection between what you're all doing at this university and what we're doing at QUT as well. So I'm hoping this will be useful. I have to apologize, I have picked up a little bit of a cold, so I'm hoping my voice will hold up, and I'll drink quite a bit of water throughout the talk as well, I think, just to survive. But I'm sure we'll be all right. Okay, so let me get started then. As I say, this is the book, and largely the talk will cover what I'm covering in this book as well. So this will be a very quick overview of the key themes of the book, as you'll see them if you read the book. But I want to start by going back a little bit to what by now is really ancient history. And of course, ancient history in web terms really means, 10, 20 years ago, the 2000s or so, when we really first started to talk about ideas like citizen journalism, ideas like social media as well. So let me start at this point, in fact. This may be familiar to some of you. This was one of the first homepages of the Independent Media Center, the Indie Media initiative, which started in 1998 around the World Trade Organization Summit in Seattle. And if you remember that time, if you were following things at the time, really the point of this initiative was, of course, that the activists who were gathering around the World Trade Organization Summit at the time were very worried that US mainstream media would really just cover the usual topics that they cover, the conflicts, the riots that might happen around an event like that, but not so much the arguments of the protesters, not so much the arguments of the people who were arguing for an alternative form of globalization, for other approaches to that taken by the World Trade Organization. So instead of simply going along with mainstream media coverage, what the activists at the time were saying was, well, let's find our own way to do media. Let's not, as they say, let's not hate the media, let's be the media, let's become the media, let's do our own coverage. And of course, this was newly possible because of the advances in web technology, the availability of the web, the availability of online publishing, the availability of platforms that allowed the very rapid publication of content as well. So this really became one of the very first initiatives to conduct what we then started to call citizen journalism. So people who were there, people who were active there, were starting to post their own updates from the summit, and particularly from the alternative events that were happening around the summit. They were posting photos, texts, they were posting some audio, even some video already at a very early stage really in the development of web technologies. And this became really a catalyst, a starting point for citizen journalism in many ways. And of course, indie media centers developed around the world. At the height, I think there were something like 400 indie media centers, IMCs around the world, doing this kind of citizen journalism work, doing this kind of alternative news publishing outside of the confines of the mainstream media industry. So this was really very much a catalyst for this whole idea of citizen journalism. And in fact, there were a great deal of very optimistic voices that emerged in response to this very early on. And throughout this talk, I'll share with you some of the sort of the key statements that were being made around this time. So, for instance, Jay Rosen talked about the rise of the people formerly known as the audience, people actually becoming journalists in their own right, doing their own coverage, no longer just being an audience for the news. Douglas Rushkoff talked about a leap to authorship, people suddenly becoming authors, becoming journalists themselves. J.D. Laziker wrote about people engaging in random acts of journalism, just doing journalism themselves, even if they were not trained journalists. You've seen many of these statements around, I'm sure. And one of the really important aspects of what they were doing is what Clase Shirky describes, which is to say that people moved from a model where they would filter, they would edit first and then publish the final work, to a model where content was published first and then the community would decide how good that content was and would filter it further. So it turns the publishing model on its head. There's no longer a very strict gatekeeping regime that's taking place where what's being published is being filtered very carefully for journalistic standards, but a lot more gets published and then the community, the readers, the audiences themselves actually decide what they think of it, how they understand everything that is being published there. And journalists themselves, to some extent, also were starting to engage with this and really recognize that readers, audiences, were a great untapped resource of background information, of additional knowledge, of additional views. So my readers know more than I do, as Dan Gilmore said at the time, one of the first blogger journalists, if you like, people who really got involved in this. So we saw the rise of news blogs, of citizen journalism sites of various forms. Of course, the practice of blogging, the platform for blogs, also became very important during this time. We saw some of these early blogs also becoming very important in various scandals and developments. So the Drudge Report, which at the time really was nothing more than a blog, broke the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal, for instance. And there were a number of other blogs that were very involved in breaking news stories as well, that mainstream journalism, for one reason or another, was not willing to touch, was not willing to report on, perhaps because they felt that they were too closely aligned with the people that they were reporting about. So blogs also, and citizen journalists also played an important role in covering some of the events that the mainstream media would not cover for various reasons. And of course, we also saw blogs like that of Salam Pax, who just happened to be, if you like, in the wrong place at the wrong time, who happened to be in Baghdad when the US raids on Saddam Hussein started to happen, and who was basically live blogging that campaign, that bombing campaign in Baghdad. So obviously there weren't any Western journalists there at the time, and so bloggers, independents started to become very important as sources of information of what's really going on the ground. These are the sorts of early developments that happen in this space. And as you see there, this is the Google Ngram viewer for the word citizen journalism, and as you see there, that term really took off from the early 2000s onwards. So suddenly we were talking a great deal more about this idea of citizen journalism that just hadn't been around much at all before. So suddenly citizen journalism seemed like it was going to fundamentally change the news industry, fundamentally disrupt the news industry. And this is sort of the gloomiest image I could find of news, I guess. The news industry was rightly worried about this. Mainstream journalism was quite worried that, yes, suddenly there is a big disruption going on, and we have to find a way to deal with this, to make do with this, to arrange ourselves perhaps, or to argue back against these upstarts, these citizen journalists who are suddenly trying to hone in on our turf, to do what we are doing. And this ultimately became something of a struggle as well between mainstream journalism and citizen journalism, of course. So the first instinct with journalists when something new happens always seems to be to criticize and to belittle new technologies. But some of the researchers who were engaging with this were quite openly saying, well, this might actually be a good thing. This might actually be a good new development because it opens up the news production process. Jane Singer, who was one of the early authors who was writing about the role of blogging and citizen journalism in this context, was saying, well, traditionally we haven't seen much of the inside of news organizations. We haven't seen how they select what they publish, how they choose what they publish. So maybe it is time to, as she says there, to let the public in on how the sausage is made, how journalism is actually produced, to understand what the good and bad parts of the journalistic production process actually are. Others were saying, well, this actually does shift the balance between journalists and audiences. This makes audiences more powerful and journalists somewhat less so. But at the same time, there is still a problem, because doing proper journalism is actually very, very difficult and very time-consuming and very expensive. Of course, to really be a citizen journalist in the full sense of the term, you have to do what journalists do, which is to be present at the scene of the event. You have to be able to travel around, to go to the places where things are happening. You have to spend your entire day, your entire working life actually doing this kind of coverage. It's not something that is easily done just on the side through random acts of journalism, but if you really want to do this at a professional level, you actually have to also invest professional amounts of time and energy. And that is very difficult for someone who isn't paid essentially for the work that they're doing. So citizen journalists were never able to fully compete with mainstream professional journalism in that sense, because they had to also make a living. They also had to have day jobs to actually sustain themselves. So what happened was that citizen journalism, that news blogs and other forms of citizen journalism focused much more on a kind of a secondary part of journalism, which is commenting, which is evaluating, which is trying to put all the threads together of what journalism reports. So rather than engaging in gatekeeping, engaging in writing news stories and selecting for the public what is important to know, citizen journalists focus much more on what I've called gate watching, which is to watch the output of various sources, of journalistic sources as well as of original sources, of government organizations, non-government organizations, and so on. They were gate watching, they were watching that output, and they were putting together all these bits and pieces in a better form to really make sense of everything that's going on in the world at the time. So this is what I've called gate watching. This is the fundamental role of gate watching. It's not so much to report on new things necessarily, but it is to understand what's being covered, what's being published elsewhere, and to bring all that together into a more digestible, more sensible package that really creates, if you like, a dossier on what's going on in the world. And in fact, some of the critics also said, well, without real journalists, without print journalists, without mainstream professional journalists, blogs, news blogs and citizen journalists might not have much to work with, because that's the raw material that they end up working with. But what they then do is perhaps to reevaluate the coverage of mainstream journalism, to put that together in different ways, to perhaps critically evaluate as well, and point out some of the biases that might exist in mainstream journalistic coverage. And so again, as many authors then soon realized, we simply can't expect that citizen journalism would be a real direct competition for commercial corporate media. Rather, it becomes a corrective, it becomes an addition, it becomes a second tier of journalistic media that operates with and builds on the coverage of mainstream journalism. Which is why some mainstream journalists, some news organizations have always described citizen journalists essentially as parasites, as people who are simply reusing what they've already published for their own uses. So that starts to create a very adversarial relationship between mainstream and citizen journalists. And so on the one hand, we've got very optimistic views, like that of Clay Shirky, who always tends to be on the optimistic side, saying this is the democratization of opinion on the net. This is essentially enabling anyone to reevaluate the news and provide new views of what's really going on in the world. We've got people like the New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman, who takes the very negative view that really the internet, because it isn't controlled and policed in any way, at its worst is just an open sewer. It's just full of garbage. And we've got the middle view, again, perhaps represented by people like Jane Singer, saying that, well, what we're actually seeing gradually is an arrangement between the two. Blogs, citizen journalism, alternative news is being normalized by mainstream journalists, is being gradually incorporated by mainstream journalism. And in fact, we've seen this also with some of the major exponents of citizen journalism in this first wave. People like Salam Pax, who was hired in the end by The Guardian to report on the Iraq War. People like Matt Drudge, who obviously became a media entrepreneur in his own right, and others who fulfilled that same role. Many of the successful citizen journalists and bloggers early on ended up simply being hired by mainstream news organizations as well and became columnists. So in many ways, this tamed that first wave of citizen journalism, the first wave of news blogging and so on. It removed the sting to some extent from this challenge to mainstream journalism. It normalized, it brought back into the journalistic fold these alternatives, and ultimately the disruption, the great disruption that some people saw that would come from citizen journalism came to nothing. In many ways now, when we see news blogs, they're often just columnists who now have renamed their columns as blogs on news websites. There isn't a great alternative network anymore of these sites. Indymedia itself also disappeared essentially. There are a few Indymedia sites around, but it's very much declined from its height of something like 400 different sites around the world to just a few dozen now. So in many ways, that first wave of citizen journalism ended up dissipating within a few years. But the story doesn't end there, of course, because what we've seen now, what we've seen in more recent years, is what I call a second wave of disruption, a second wave of a challenge to the news industry, and that wave, I think, is being much more significant in its disruption, in its challenge. So it starts somewhere like this. I don't know if any of you recognize this drawing. This is the first, obviously, pen and paper sketch of what would become Twitter. At that point, still called my.stat.us, my status. But you see there in the drawing already many of the fundamental features of Twitter represented. A short message format, the ability to tell people what you're doing, what's currently going on in your world, and this is really the first nucleus of what would become Twitter. And this is from the early months of 2006 or so, when that platform was first being developed. So that's the very starting point. Thank you. That's the very starting point of this new wave of disruption in many ways. And I'm not saying that it's purely based on Twitter, but there are a number of these sorts of sites that are actually part of this new disruption as well. And then, of course, it goes on to something like this a few years later. The famous plane landing on the Hudson River in New York. And the first reports, as you see there from this image from Yannis Krums, the first reports of this coming not from professional journalists, although there are plenty of journalistic institutions located immediately around the river, but simply from someone who happened to be on a ferry going across the river at the time, taking a photo just as that ferry is coming in to help the stranded plane and pick up the passengers. And this was, of course, then posted almost immediately via TwitPic to Twitter and became major news around the world. So suddenly we're seeing this kind of first-hand reporting by ordinary bystanders who just, again, happen to be caught up in the moment at the time. We have cases like this as well. This may not be familiar to you, but essentially, and you read it, I guess, from the bottom to the top here as well. This is a guy called Sohaib Attar just saying, whoa, there's a big bang here. I'm in Abbottabad in Pakistan. There's a big bang here. Don't know what's going on. There's a helicopter hovering. That's very unusual at this time of night. And you know, something must be going on here. As it turned out, the next day, he had just live tweeted the raid on the compound where Osama bin Laden was hiding and was killed. So suddenly you've got these bystanders just being caught up again in these moments without even knowing it, basically live tweeting this without even knowing that it was going on. So you've got these sorts of events, and anyone around the world suddenly, if they're near a mobile phone and near a connection to a social medium, can of course then live report these sorts of events. Of course, we've got some more prominent people also getting in on the act, and this seems like a very long time ago now. And this seems like a long time ago now too, actually. So you've got, but again, you've got things that, in this case, are again live from the playing field just immediately after the final whistle. So we've got anyone who happens to be equipped enough being able to report these things straight away without mediation by professional media, of course. So this is a major disruption now as well. The flows of information are changing much more fundamentally than they did in the first wave of disruption with citizen journalism and with news blogs, because these tools are now much more ubiquitous. It's a lot easier to post something just quickly on Twitter than it is to set up a news blog and write a blog entry commenting on something that's going on in the world. So we're seeing now the rise of social media as, of course, a form of citizen media as well. And in fact, we've seen this early on, particularly during crisis moments. And this should not be unfamiliar to many of you here who've also worked on crisis communication via social media, of course. So for citizens themselves, it becomes a source of information, but also a way to disseminate information. As Jeff Jarvis wrote at a time, the witnesses are taking over the news. He didn't just say that in general, but this was actually in response to the siege on the hotel in Mumbai in 2008, where people who were caught up in that siege when Islamist terrorists were attacking the hotel, people were actually caught up in the hotel tweeting from their hotel room saying, "This is what's going on, please help us." So these are not just witnesses, they are people who are really caught up in the event itself, actually live tweeting about what's going on and calling for help. So this is the immediacy of these platforms now, which is I think still yet greater than what we've seen before with citizen journalism and news blogs. And in many ways, you know, as Christoph Neuberger said, it's a seismograph for current and surprising events. It's something that many of us find out about new events through as well. We're actually seeing these things first appear now via social media in many cases. And I think, and you know, I guess in Chile, the idea of a seismograph is quite well known. But in this case, I think that the term is particularly relevant as well, because in many cases, we've seen now that people are using social media information to detect earthquakes as well. The US Geological Survey is doing this because, in fact, the tweets travel faster than sound waves through Earth. So in many cases, they're able to detect the fact that an earthquake has occurred more quickly from a distance than via traditional seismographs. So this is a very meaningful metaphor, I think. And journalists themselves are starting to recognize this as well, and journalism scholars certainly are. As Emily Bell says, there's journalism before Twitter and after Twitter. Again, this may exaggerate the role of Twitter a little bit. Other social media platforms obviously also have an important role to play here, but I think it's a useful way of thinking about it. And so, to think about it, I guess a number of us have started to think through the metaphors that exist around this. Alfred Hermina has talked a lot about ambient journalism, social awareness streams. So essentially, this is always on in the background somewhere, and we're always peripherally aware of what's going on these platforms, perhaps by following them, by having the stream somewhere in a browser window, for instance, or on our phones or wherever. And by logging in from time to time, by looking at it from time to time, we are peripherally aware of what's going on. And from time to time, then, it moves into the foreground as something important happens, as a major development happens. And it happens outside, as he says, outside of the structures of formal journalism. The really important thing, I think, with all of this is that these are not platforms that are owned either by citizens or by journalists, but they are a third space where journalists and citizens and everyone else exists side by side. So these are not spaces as they were in the first wave of disruption, where you had professional news sites on the one hand and alternative citizen news sites citizen journalism sites, news blogs and so on the other. But all of these actors are now coming together, are now coexisting on a platform that is owned by a third party, by Facebook, by Twitter. So they are both playing to the rules of a third party. In that sense, they have no greater power, independent of who they are. A journalist and a professional journalist and a citizen journalist both simply have a Twitter account, both simply have a Facebook account, and must follow the same rules of the platform in these spaces. So it becomes, as Gilad Lotan says, a common medium for both of them, where they do interact, and perhaps where they do interact a great deal more than they used to do when we had that neat distinction between professional and citizen journalism sites. And the role of the audience, the role of the greater public also becomes more important, because what becomes visible on these platforms becomes visible because many of us, many of the users of these platforms are endorsing it by sharing it, liking it, retweeting it, commenting on it, whatever the platform actually enables us to do. So as Sharon Meraz and Zizi Papagarisi are saying, we are crowdsourcing certain actors and certain statements to visibility, to prominence. We are making them prominent because we are retweeting, because we are sharing, because we are responding in some form or other. So that's really the logic of the algorithms of these platforms, that what people engage with becomes more visible. And that is a form ultimately of crowdsourcing that's encouraged by the algorithms themselves. Why is this important? Well, because of this. This is from the Reuters Institute for the Future of Journalism from the annual digital news report from last year. And what this shows is essentially the very significant generational shift that's going on in the consumption of news. See if I can get the pointer to work. You'll see there that TV on the right side there is a medium that's still quite popular with all older generations, but becomes increasingly less popular as a source of news with younger generations. Whereas online media is exceptionally popular now with the younger generations, and as part of that, social media as well is an increasingly important source of news for younger generations. So this really documents, I think, a massive generational shift. This is from a survey, I think, of 34 different countries in that particular year. So this is happening around the world, essentially. This is a trend that's happening around the world, obviously in some countries slightly faster than in others, but there is a very significant shift that's going on here from older to younger generations, and it's ultimately particularly a shift from TV as the first source of news to online media as the first source of news. As you see there, radio and print hardly matter as a first source of news anymore in the first place. So this is why this shift towards online media, this shift particularly towards social media like Twitter and Facebook, is so crucial, because it really changes where people are getting their news from, and so the logic of the media that people are getting their news from also becomes incredibly important. So again, this is sort of again another gloomy picture that I could find of a printing press for newspapers. Again, if you're in the newspaper business, then you might want to seek other employment, I think, at this point. But overall, the picture for journalism, of course, might look somewhat gloomy with this shift towards online and social media as news sources, given the difficulties of making these work economically, financially. But of course, journalism and both journalists and the journalism industry have responded in various ways. There is now, at the moment, still, of course, also very much a transition point. We're in a hybrid situation where there is a shift between old and new media, but that shift is far from complete. And so right now we're seeing a mix of these media forms that we're dealing with. We again see that, of course, journalists themselves have trouble still understanding this new environment that they're operating in. Journalists and news organizations, I should say, both have trouble understanding this environment that they're operating in. It is still very much uncommon ground to both journalists, news organizations themselves, and in fact citizens, ordinary people as well, of course. We're still all trying to make sense of how this works and what the pros and cons are, the benefits and obstacles are that we're dealing with here. But what we're seeing in these spaces is what Christoph Neuberger has called spontaneously emerging encounter publics. So we're seeing these publics, these ad hoc publics that emerge from time to time around particular topics and issues. We're seeing them emerge obviously around crisis events, around major sudden developments, unexpected developments, but we're also seeing them emerge around themes, around topics that might be of a longer term nature. So we're seeing, for instance, obviously an ad hoc public that's emerged around the Trump and Russia collusion discussion. We're seeing publics like that emerge around other forms of crises and scandals as well. So what's possible within social media is that these publics can form very rapidly and can persist for as long as they need to persist in order to fully trace and track and discuss particular news developments and political developments. And they are largely uncontrolled. This is one of the statements that Jürgen Habermas has made about particularly the rise of internet media, I guess, is that what he calls the wild flows of messages, the peripheral flows of messages around the central traditional mainstream news media, that's now becoming much more important, and much more important as a source of information, as a source of news for many people. So we're seeing a shift again away from the mainstream, the traditional news media like TV, towards a much more user-controlled space in which information travels in many different ways amongst people, and that is no longer simply controlled by mainstream news organizations and their journalists. So in many ways, my argument here is that because so many of us are now engaging in the sharing, the commenting, the liking, the retweeting, and all of the other things that we can do to news content via social media, we're actually seeing a shift away from these random acts of journalism to much more habitual acts of gatewatching, of seeing what different types of news we encounter online and then sharing them with others. So this has become this is no longer something that just a small group of self-declared citizen journalists and news bloggers are doing, but if you think about your own practices, I'm sure all of us have already this week shared some news item via social media in some form. Whether it's on Facebook or Twitter or WhatsApp or some other medium, but all of us are constantly sharing the news at least a little bit with our networks, with our social networks on our various platforms. So this has become a habitual thing. Some of us do it much more than others, no doubt, but it has become very much habitual. We know that when we see something, a bit of news that we think is of interest to the people who we're connected with, then we will share that on to them as well. It's become absolutely commonplace. This is still not that sort of rise of democratic opinion. There's still not that rise of a democratization of opinion that Clay Shirky was talking about with the first wave of disruption, of course. But because we still don't have equal voices. Some of us have much better, much bigger, much larger networks than others. But it is what I'd call a democratization. And what I mean by that is that it's become very widespread across the general public. It's become very widespread across all of us. It's not quite a popular form in a sense that everyone likes doing it, but it's popular in a sense that many people throughout society are doing it. So that's what I mean by demotic. There's very widespread participation in this kind of news sharing and the gate watching that precedes it in order to find the news that we want to share in the first place. So in many ways, as we all do this and as we all that way crowdsource particular news items to greater visibility, to greater attention, what we're doing is curating the news together. We're engaging in news curation. We're all individually engaging in news curation on our own feeds. So as I'm sharing information on my Twitter feed, on my Facebook feed, obviously that's a form of curation of the things that I'm interested in, the bits of news, the bits of new information that I'm interested in. But as we all do this side by side in social media spaces, in the networks that we belong to, there's also a collective, a collaborative form of news curation that's going on amongst all of us. And that includes not just us as ordinary people, perhaps, or us as academics, or us as whatever other professions we might be, but it includes, of course, mainstream journalists as well, who are also active increasingly in social media spaces. So collectively, whoever we are, with the very different types of people that we are actually curating the news via social media as well, through this ongoing, constant sharing of news via social media. And this is, again, why this is important. I want to say two things. First, this is again from the Reuters Institute Digital News Report from last year, from 2016 in this case. I want to say two things. First, this is a really bad graph. It's a really bad graph because you see there that the 48 looks a lot smaller than the 21 and the 31. So in terms of visual design, no points for them, unfortunately, in this case. But it's important because, and I think this will pop up, yes, because if you take together these two categories that they have created here of proactive and reactive participators, and if you look through what people are doing, then it's the majority of social media users actually who are engaged in news sharing, in liking and sharing and commenting on the news. So these are things like, of course, writing a blog post, taking part in a campaign or group based around a news subject, commenting on a news story in a social network, commenting on a website, posting, sending a news-related picture or video to a social network site, posting, sending a picture or video to a news website or news organization, sharing a news story via a social network, sharing a news story via email, rating, liking, or favoriting a news story. All of these things that ultimately bring news to greater attention in your own social network. So more than half of all users are engaging in this, as it says there in the question at the bottom there, during an average week. So more than half of all social media users are actually engaged in this form of news curation for their network and with their network in an average week. So this is, again, this is a very widespread practice. That's why I'm calling it a demotic practice, because it is really spread throughout the user base of these platforms now. And it is something that has become absolutely habitual because everyone's doing it in an average week, even on an average day. So this is, I think, why this is important. This is why this is an important, again, threat and challenge to the media industry. And the industry, again, when the news industry is threatened, it tends to respond first by being aggressive about it and by just denying the problem. So much of the early response by news organizations, by some journalists as well, has been to belittle and to vilify social media as just, radicals and strange people who are constantly just criticizing journalism. This is from the former editor of the Australian, the national newspaper in Australia, who said that Twitter is no more than a left-wing echo chamber. So you get these sort of instant dismissals from someone who is himself a very staunch conservative, of course. They've also tried to just outlaw the sharing of their news in many cases. So they've set up paywalls, they've set up premium access, they've set up ad blockers and so on. This is essentially making it more difficult for people to share news content via social media. But the editor of The Guardian, the former editor of The Guardian, I should say, Alan Brasbridger, has said, well, why would we do this? Newspapers should want to be open and collaborative. If we don't want our news to be shared widely, why do we even publish news? So in many ways, it seems quite counterintuitive for newspapers to set up paywalls and to set up premium access and so on, to set up blocks to having their news being shared, because ultimately their very purpose is to inform the public. Of course, they still need to make money from it, and I understand that argument, but at the same time, they should want their news to be widely circulated, because that would show that the news that they're covering is important. It seems counterintuitive to keep their users, to keep their readers from actually engaging in this way with the news that they publish. often these first initial negative responses have ended up being revised after major events, after major natural disasters, major political scandals, major crises of various forms in which social media were proven to be important. So after a major political development in Australia where one political leader was replaced by someone else in their party, there was essentially a party coup, a coup inside the party room, if you like. For instance, one of the leading Australian social media journalists was saying, well, after that time, I can't tell you how many times I've heard journalists suddenly say, well, I better get onto Twitter now because it's obviously really important. This is where I got all the information from about what was really going on in the party room. So now suddenly all the journalists want to join Twitter. So when they finally see that Twitter is important, that Twitter is relevant, that Twitter and other social media, of course, are an important source of information, particularly during these crisis events, during these acute events, suddenly they realize, well, actually, I should probably be on there as well, because if I'm not on there, I'm actually missing out on a lot of really valuable information. And then as newsrooms, as news organizations particularly are realizing this, in many cases what they've also started to do is create these social media editors. Sometimes they're called social media evangelists, community coordinators. There's various terms for this that essentially are there to bring more and more of their journalists onto social media. So they're inside the newsroom. They're the first people often who were on social media and who are now tasked with training all the other journalists to join social media, to use social media effectively. And in fact, in an interview with Joy Meyer, the then head of digital engagement for The Guardian, that's another one of these job titles, said, well, I will have been successful as a social media evangelist at The Guardian when my job is no longer needed. So when all the other Guardian journalists are finally on social media, I'm no longer needed, and that will be a sign of my success. So in many cases, we've had these early adopters amongst journalists who are now being drawn in, drafted in to train everyone else how to use social media effectively. And journalists themselves, as opposed to the news organizations, are increasingly also realizing the benefits of using social media, of course. Many of them are now starting to accept that social media, Twitter and other social media, are simply part of the tools of the trade, are simply what you need to use anyway. And this is particularly perhaps amongst younger journalists who see this also as an advantage in their job. Silvia Costello from the BBC's UGC Hub, User Generated Content Hub, has been saying, well, if you're now starting out as a journalist, if you're a young journalist, you simply won't make it in this profession unless you're on social media, unless you know how to use social media well. So this is now simply a required tool of the trade for journalists. And for those who can do it well, they can actually use this for personal branding distinct from their organization as well. They might now become essentially what people go to. They're no longer going to The Guardian, but they're going to that journalist that they know from The Guardian, that journalist that they follow from The Guardian. So as Logan Molyneux and Avery Holton are saying, individuals are perhaps replacing institutions as the fundamental unit here. So you can now put together an interesting feed of news, not so much by following The Guardian and CNN and the New York Times, but by following individual journalists from those outlets and others who have the right and the interesting and the latest information for you via social media. And that, of course, also means there are new ways of working as a journalist that are evolving here. So journalists are now also becoming news curators, not just news reporters. So they are themselves also immersed in these social awareness streams that Alfred Hermida has talked about. They're pulling together information from their various contacts, bundling this together and pushing it out via their social media streams as well. And that, again, is a new way of working, becoming, as he says, they're a newswire, newsroom, and that should be news outlet at the same time. So they themselves are now becoming a news outlet, almost bypassing the news organizations that they're working for. And here's an example. Does anyone recognize this guy? And you probably don't, because this is the type of journalistic news curator that I'm talking about. Someone who pulls together all of this information into a new channel, but it's someone who themselves doesn't become very visible in doing so. This is Andy Carvin, who was one of the key sources of reliable information during the Arab Spring. And you see there how he operates. Obviously, he's got 2 screens there on either side with social media feeds from various sources. He's got a news article up on the main screen in the middle. He's got little gloves on, perhaps to keep himself from developing carpal tunnel syndrome or other afflictions from typing so much and doing so much work. He's got headphones there in front of him in case he needs to listen to some video or audio perhaps that's being posted from the event. So essentially what he's doing there, and you can see this, is he's drawing together all these bits of information from the various streams that he's following, from the various people that he's following, and pulling that together into his social media feed by retweeting, by commenting, by resharing, by adding information to this, by adding evaluation and commentary to it all. But he's doing this from an office at National Public Radio in Washington. He's not actually on the scene. He's not actually at Tahrir Square in Cairo. He's not actually in the region at all. He's simply got a very good network of contacts whom he's evaluated and whom he trusts in the region and pulling together all of this information. So this is the sort of news curator, this is the sort of role of journalistic news curator that I'm talking about. Someone who is able to evaluate for us, for his audience, a number of different feeds of information and pulls that together into a single package that you can follow to get a considered view of what's going on at this time in Egypt during the unrest of the Arab Spring. That's the sort of new roles that are actually emerging here right now. And he has been one of the first and the most celebrated of these news curators who have emerged at this point. But again, he's actually not even employed formally as a journalist. He's a social media, I forget what actual role they gave him, but he's essentially a social media person for National Public Radio who just happened to have the right connections to be able to do this kind of job. And he's been very widely written about now by journalism researchers because he exemplifies this new role so well. If you're looking for other people like this as well, one other person I would recommend, particularly on the Trump-Russia collusion scandal at this point, is a guy called Seth Abramson, who is again, not a traditional journalist, but a professor at the University of New Hampshire, who happens to have been following all of these developments very well and is pulling together, again, all of this kind of information that's floating around, evaluating all of this information that's floating around about the collusion between Trump and Putin, and pulling this together into a very useful feed. So these kinds of journalistic, quasi-journalistic roles are emerging more and more now around all these different topics. So this is the kind of new role and new possibility that's also emerging for journalists. But of course, these people still need to make a living somehow. So it's not simply that they all emerge and everything will be wonderful from here on in, because at the same time, the shift towards online, the shift away from more conventional journalistic modes of operation, the shift to social media, to sharing content via social media also means that a lot of the traditional sources of funding for journalism are drying up or are moving much more towards social media platforms rather than to news organizations and individual journalists. So as these networks are reshaping, there are still many questions to answer and still many problems ahead as well. So in the first place, and this is again exemplified these days particularly well perhaps by Donald Trump, the shift towards social media also means that the engagement between journalists and their and the people that they report about changes as well. So the traditional model of journalistic reporting, particularly with politicians, is, as Marcel Brosmer and Todd Graham call it, their negotiation through conversation. You do an interview, you ask people critical questions, and they respond in various ways, and then you report about it. But these days we're seeing more and more politicians shifting towards not doing interviews, but simply making statements via social media. Again, I don't need to mention the orange guy, but he is very obviously an example of this. Although, in fact, Brosmer and Graham here are talking about Geert Wilders, a far-right politician in the Netherlands, who really was a much earlier example of this. Thank you. Who again doesn't give interviews, he just makes statements via social media. And all that all that journalists can then do is to report those statements. They can comment on them, but they can't critically ask questions. They can simply say, well, Geert Wilders or Donald Trump tweeted this, and here you are, and make of that what you will. So the idea of the journalistic interview as a way to really critically ask questions of politicians disappears when politicians no longer do this and simply make their statements via Twitter or other platforms. There is also the challenge that the more journalists are themselves interacting with each other via social media, the more that there is also perhaps a tendency towards groupthink, towards echo chambers, towards them just repeating each other's viewpoints because they're all constantly exposed to them. They're, of course, all following each other in order to see what they're all reporting. So if someone says, oh, this is going to be bad for Trump, then perhaps everyone else is going to say, well, this is going to be bad for Trump, except for Fox News, of course. So you're starting to see perhaps this kind of groupthink more and more reinforced, as one of the journalists there that John Palmley interviewed has been saying. At the same time, this is not necessarily the case. So this idea that by following each other, we are falling into a filter bubble, we are falling into just seeing information that reinforces our own views. If all journalists inside the Washington Beltway are following each other, that they're just reinforcing each other's views. Of course, you can break out of that. You design your own filter bubble by choosing who you follow, choosing who you interact with. So as Paul Bradshaw of the Online Journalism blog has said, well, you design your own filter bubble, and you can choose to follow people who challenge your views as well. And that perhaps is particularly important for journalists to do, and for people who are interested in the news to do, so that we encounter alternative views. We encounter the views of the other side as much as those views that we sympathize with already. And so the same journalist that Palmley interviewed also said the conversations that political reporters would have at the press table have now become visible via Twitter. And that means there's greater scrutiny as well, greater public scrutiny for what journalists are thinking, what journalists are telling each other, and greater opportunity for criticism of journalistic views as well. Okay. So in many ways, there is a potential, yes, for more groupthink as journalists are interconnecting better with each other via social media. There are concerns about echo chambers and filter bubbles. But at the same time, there's also much more exposure of all of this to outside influences, much more opportunity for ordinary users, for others to talk back at them, to engage more with them and say, well, actually, here's another interpretation of what you've just said, what you've just reported on, and perhaps there's other perspectives on all of this. And in fact, in the end, what it really does is it kind of removes the journalists from the center of the news process, as more and more others are able to engage as well, as ordinary users, as experts, as the sources of information themselves are also able to engage much more directly in the discussion that's going on here. And we've seen this again, particularly around cases like Trump and others as well. In many ways, there is again perhaps some form of normalization that's going on here, just as we've seen in the first wave, the normalization of blogs into the journalistic process. But I'd actually argue that perhaps the direction here is somewhat different. On the one hand, yes, journalists are of course using social media much more as part of their daily routines. And in fact, some of them are seeing some real payoffs from this. So as they're saying here, being more involved on Twitter can really increase your popularity, can increase your the responses that you're getting from your audience. And in many ways, for journalists, that means that they might have better job prospects as well in a very precarious industry. As this journalist there says, you become a walking, talking, texting, tweeting, whatever billboard for yourself. You promote yourself via social media as someone who knows their stuff, as someone who's a good journalist, and perhaps hopefully will still have a job in the industry tomorrow and next week and next month and next year, even though many outlets are closing down or reducing the number of staff. So the more visible journalists, the more active journalists on social media are perhaps more likely also to retain their jobs when others don't. And so in many ways then the journalist itself, the journalists themselves becomes part of the product of journalism as well. It's no longer just the news items themselves, but it's actually the personality, the entity of the journalist, the personal brand of the journalist as well, that becomes important in all of this. This is also problematic, of course, because personal branding might be quite possible for a very sort of mainstream, generic, straight white male journalist, might be a lot more difficult for someone who's from a minority, who is perhaps more vulnerable to attack. We've already seen many attacks on female journalists, for instance. We've seen attacks on journalists from minorities. So personal branding is not something that's equally available perhaps to different people. And people who are from more vulnerable groups may therefore also be pushed out of the journalism industry much more than their male white colleagues might be. So this is also a very significant concern, of course, in this push towards personal branding for journalists. So in many ways, what we're seeing here is perhaps, yes, the normalization of social media into journalism, but I would actually argue that perhaps the push goes the other way, that journalism is being normalized into social media, that it's not so much that social media is adopting sort of a news logic, but in many ways journalists are starting to adopt a social media logic. And that could, the effects of that, the end result of that, I think is not really quite known yet, but I think it has the potential to very fundamentally change how journalism operates, how the journalism industry operates as well. So if more and more journalism is adopting a social media logic, then of course that gives social media platforms, social media users perhaps also a very significant level of power over journalism itself. And again, if journalists, if their content are essentially freely circulating on Twitter, who actually pays the bills? Where's the money coming from to make these people be able to pay a living? And who pays the bills is partly determined by things like this. This is one of the tracking interfaces that social media platforms, that news organizations are using to track the impact of their stories on social media. So you see there just a list of different platforms that they're tracking: Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, Twitter, how influencers, how creators, how others are engaging with their content. You see there the response that they're getting for stories on Facebook, on different platforms there. And more, of course, news organizations are paying very, very active and very detailed attention to these sorts of social media metrics. They're shaping their stories, they're certainly shaping their headlines to increase shareability, increase visibility of their stories via social media. That is maybe a positive thing in many ways for them, because it helps them get their stories out and helps them circulate more, maybe generate some more ad revenue. But it might also mean that we're getting more of the stories that do well on social media, which may not necessarily be the stories that are important for us to know. So if it is all sorts of stories about the world's oldest man dying or whatever, that's perhaps not as important as stories about the collusion between Trump and Russia. So this is a very double-edged sword. It enables news organizations to shape their stories much more to what their audiences apparently want. But what audiences apparently want is maybe not necessarily what audiences need as well. So the quantification of journalism, the increased use of these metrics, is in full swing now in the journalism industry, measuring all sorts of audience behavior, all sorts of audience response. But in many cases, these metrics are still very underdeveloped as well. There's this wonderful quote here from a report from 2014, and I think things have not really changed all that much, saying that the current forms of analytics are very good at understanding the main ways in which people use digital media in 2010. So they're very much behind current uses. They're very much behind understanding current uses of social media, current responses by audiences to the news. And they're being used essentially without much understanding. So this is a newsroom manager who was interviewed by Edson Tandock Jr. saying, well, it's like crack, you know. You can sit there seeing it pop all night. All sorts of stuff is going on. The metrics are going up and down. It all looks wonderful. It's very colorful. You've seen the screen there. It looks beautiful, I'm sure, when it's in motion. But at the same time, you have no idea what any of it means. You just see, yes, we got some more readers there and some fewer readers there. But why? No one knows. These are just almost random numbers. But you have to follow it, because if the company's not making money, then I might get laid off. I might lose my job. So you have to increase your metrics in order to be successful, but you have no idea whether the metrics that you're increasing are actually important, are actually meaningful, actually mean that you get the audiences that you want, the audiences that you need, and that your audiences are getting anything out of the information that you provide. And of course, the more particular metrics are seen as important, the more platforms, news providers will also try to game them. Will try to somehow boost their own metrics. We've seen this at a time, for instance, when people were measuring the number of pages that were being visited on a site. They would start splitting up news stories across multiple pages. So that with a single news story, you suddenly have 2, 4, 5 impressions. So this is the sort of gaming that we're talking about. And Jonah Peretti, by the way, if you don't recognize the name, he's the founder of BuzzFeed, so he knows a bit about metrics. He knows a bit about how to game metrics as well, frankly. So this is someone who actually understands this quite well. And BuzzFeed, as he says there, has been built around the proposition that journalism will be distributed via social media. So BuzzFeed has been, in fact, one of the really successful stories here, because it has been built around clickbait. It has been built around listicles, around lots of meaningless but very popular content. But what it also has been able to do now is to subsidize the production of much more hard-hitting, much more critical journalism by the money that all of that meaningless content has brought in. So BuzzFeed, in many ways, is a success story here, even though it's still very much hated by much of the mainstream news industry for what it does and for all the other things that it publishes as well. But if you look at BuzzFeed in many countries now, they've started to hire some very serious, very established journalists to do their political reporting, and have broken quite a number of stories now that have been of significant political importance. So what we're seeing here, though, for better or for worse, is a feedback loop between gatekeeping and gatewatching. Newsrooms still have some gatekeeping processes, obviously, that decide what gets published and what doesn't via the news site. But then they're looking at how audiences are gate-watching, what audiences are choosing to retweet, to share, to like, to comment on, to engage with, to share via their own social networks. All of that's gate-watching. And that then influences, again, the gatekeeping decisions made in the newsrooms. So now audiences and journalists, audiences and news organizations are in a much closer feedback loop that influences the future direction of news organizations in what they publish. So that's really what this quantification of journalism has produced. For better or for worse, depending on how this is being guided, of course, it might mean that we're getting much more ongoing populist and cheap but popular content, or, of course, that there's also a push towards more quality content that nonetheless gets readers. So that remains to be seen. And finally, really what all of this results in is, of course, that the more journalism happens via social media, the more the social media platforms themselves also have a great deal of power. So in many ways, journalism has been a marketing tool for Twitter, particularly for Facebook to some extent as well, but certainly for Twitter. Twitter prides itself on being the place where news breaks. And it hasn't had to pay a single journalist to do that. It's just that journalists and news organizations, and of course ordinary users as well, are using Twitter because it's such a fast-paced medium to break the news. So in many ways, this has been what's kept Twitter afloat. It's been that everyone finds it such a useful platform for news. But of course, none of that benefit that Twitter and other platforms derive from this flows back to the news organizations. The ad revenue is now swallowed up by the tech companies, not by the news companies. Newspaper websites, again, this is quite a strong statement perhaps, but essentially newspaper websites are transformed, as Ali Nabil Ahmad said there, into appendages of Americanized corporate information capitalism. I'm not quite sure if I'd quite use those terms, but there's some truth to this. Newspaper websites are now simply being marketing tools in many cases for social media platforms as well. And for news organizations, that's a very difficult trade-off to make because yes, you need to be on social media. That's where people increasingly are going to get news, but that's not where you're going to make your money. You're going to make your money by enticing people back to your own website because that's where you gain ad revenue. And that is a very much an unresolved problem, an unresolved challenge, because more and more people are simply staying on the social media platform themselves. Facebook, for instance, has introduced its instant articles where you can actually read the entire article just on the Facebook platform without ever having to leave Facebook. So Facebook, of course, gets the ad revenue from that. But at the same time, Facebook and others are still saying, oh, no, we're definitely not a media company. No, you've got that all wrong. We're simply a carriage. We're simply a carriage service. We're simply providing people with the means to communicate. But we're not a media company. We shouldn't be held responsible for anything that happens on the platform. We are important in many ways, but we're certainly not a media company. This is still the line that they're trying to trot out. I think not for very much longer, because obviously we've seen quite a bit of backlash against that sort of line, but they've been very careful for all sorts of reasons to distance themselves from the idea that they themselves might be a media company and might need to be treated by law as a media company in that sense. But very obviously, in order for journalism, I think, to survive and flourish, there is a need to try and somehow reroute some of the revenue streams that now channel all of this ad revenue to these platforms back to the content producers themselves, who ultimately make these platforms successful as well. That's a very difficult challenge, though, because these platforms are such massive companies. Obviously, we've had just over the last few days the news that Apple now is $1 trillion company. We've had massive valuations for many of the other companies, for Facebook and Twitter and so on as well. So it's very difficult to go up against these giants, particularly from outside of the US, and to try and force them to perhaps share their revenue more with the content providers themselves. But I think that needs to happen, and maybe to some extent the current panic around fake news, the current panic around the role that these platforms have in some of this might be a brief window of opportunity for regulatory intervention. It might be possible, and certainly both in the US and in Europe, there's been some first attempts to do this. There might be an opportunity now to use this to say, well, in order to escape greater forms of regulatory intervention, of regulation, you must share your revenues somewhat more fairly with news organizations. But that's still a long way to go to get there. But this is a start. This is the legal counsels of Facebook, Twitter, and Google appearing before Congress. Of course, I could have also put up the photo of Commander Data appearing before Congress. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg appearing before Congress, looking like Commander Data. So there's been a few of these appearances. Of course, Zuckerberg's also appeared before the European Parliament, and they're being brought to bear. I was almost going to say brought to justice a little bit more here, but that hasn't yet produced any significant changes, and it remains to be seen whether it does. So, a very quick summary of the key themes of what I've talked about here as I get to the end. There is very obviously a very significant shift towards social media as a primary news source. That's very much documented by the Reuters Institute Digital News Report. For these users, for these social media users, gate watching, news sharing, so the identifying of interesting news and the sharing of those news with their own social networks is becoming absolutely habitual. Everyone's doing this, at least to some extent. Some people much more than others, obviously, but everyone's engaged in some form or other as it happens. And this happens in social media spaces that really are not controlled either by ordinary users nor by journalists, but by third parties. And those third-party spaces don't privilege any one group of users inherently. They privilege the users who, in one way or another, have gathered large audiences for what they do, for what they say on social media. And those could be, yes, journalists, they could be celebrities, they could be netizens, they could be ordinary users. There isn't necessarily a fundamental pattern to this. That provides some opportunities for enterprising journalists to be news creators, to create personal brands, but of course that's much more possible perhaps for some journalists than others, for people who really understand the medium in the first place, and for people who are able to cope with the additional personal visibility that generates for them, who essentially don't mind or are able to cope with becoming celebrities in that sense as well. And that might not be for everyone, and might certainly not be for particular types of people, particularly for particular minorities. So this is not possible equally for every journalist, certainly. The question then is whether this is really normalizing social media into journalistic logics, or I would argue is normalizing journalism into social media, applying a social media logic to how journalism works, and that would be a very significant transformation of journalism in the longer term. And as that happens, the question of funding is particularly problematic, because so much of the funding for journalism depends on ad revenue, and that ad revenue is going to the platforms, not to the news organizations themselves. As that happens, we're seeing more and more of that metrification, the quantification of engagement that may invite populism, that may invite the gaming of the metrics, but it could also help, of course, news organizations to understand their audiences better if they can find meaningful metrics through which they can understand their audiences. But again, the platforms are still siphoning off most of the revenue here, and that, I think, is a long-term project, a problem that simply hasn't been addressed effectively yet. So, and this is kind of a hopeful point on which to end in a less than hopeful time. I think what needs to happen is, through various forms of pressure, to try and enforce the corporate social responsibility of platforms beyond empty statements, beyond just the show of responsibility, but really at a much more fundamental basis. It's going to be important to force these platforms into accepting their responsibility in society, across societies around the world, as sources of news, as sources of information, as spaces for discussion, conversation, discourse. And I think that's still got quite a long way to go, unfortunately, and the platforms will fight to try and escape obligations for as long as they possibly can, I think. So that's the overall sort of argument of the book. I hope this has been useful. I'd be happy to answer some questions as well. And other than that, thank you very much for listening.
¿Aló?
Gracias, profesor Bruns. Queríamos abrir la conversación. No sé si hay algunas preguntas que quieran formularle a Axel. Estas pueden ser, por supuesto, en español. ¿Alguna pregunta?
¿Acá? Por acá.
Camilo Zavala, ¿qué tal? Yo te quería preguntar cuál es el principal propósito de las redes sociales, ¿atraer usuarios a la web o que los usuarios permanezcan en las redes sociales mismas, desde el punto de vista del contenido, obviamente?
He wants to know what is the role of social media regarding audiences, just to attract them to the social media, or that they stay inside with the content? Inside the net, the social media.
Okay.
Just to attract them and to track this kind of presence of the audiences, or?
Yeah. I think the way things work at this point is that audiences are engaging with the news within social media platforms. We're seeing a lot of news content that's circulating via social media. We're seeing only a limited amount of click-throughs from the social media platforms to the news organizations themselves. That's why some news organizations have introduced barriers to sharing their content, because that really means that ultimately you have to go to the platform, you have to go to the news site to see what they're covering. I think a lot of that, unfortunately, has been counterproductive, because it just means that their content circulates less and even fewer people go to their news sites themselves. Some news organizations, of course, have tried to experiment and to collaborate with the platform providers themselves to provide more of their content natively within social media. And that makes that content much more visible and increases engagement with the content, but it also reduces the revenue that they're getting, because, of course, if people then don't have to click through to the news site, then none of the ads on the news site are being triggered, and that's really where the source of revenue is for those news organizations. But also the other thing that we're seeing very much, of course, is that a lot of people inform themselves via social media now, not so much by reading the entire article, but just by seeing headlines and maybe the first paragraph of the article as well. So that itself is also problematic, because what circulates now and what people are engaging with might just be the first part of the article, not the full story. Having said that, that probably has been true in the past as well, that people don't necessarily read a news article all the way to the end, even when they went to a news website or when they bought a paper. In that sense, that's possibly not necessarily something new, but essentially at the moment, I think much of the engagement via social media with news tends to be on the platform, with much more limited click-through to the actual news site itself.
¿Quiere hacer una observación?
Y mi otra pregunta es, ¿qué proyección le ves al periodismo móvil, el Mojo, de Jeff Jarvis?
Which kind of protection? I see. Yeah, that's a really good question. It is very difficult to predict the future in such a fast-moving environment. I think there are a number of initiatives that are interesting, and I don't just actually mean mobile here, but clearly. In many cases, there's also a very strong move from desktop-based to mobile devices in various forms. That could be phones, that could be tablets, it could be watches, it could be a number of other devices that exist. So more and more, I think, journalism is being shaped around those devices as well. The presentation of journalism is being shaped around those devices. That again might shift the format of stories, I guess, to something that's much more condensed and shorter, and doesn't necessarily work well for long-form investigative journalism, for instance, but really is much more just short news bits, essentially, that can circulate easily. The other interesting development that I think we should watch is the emergence of audio devices, Alexa and Google Home and these sorts of tools that essentially don't have a visual user interface, but that you interact with via voice. And And in those cases, again, you probably won't want to listen to a very long article being read out to you by the device. So you probably just ask Alexa, what's in the news? And you get 3, 4, 5 headlines, and maybe just a sentence or so. You get digest form, bulletin form news. And the other thing with those devices that's also important is they tend to have a default news provider built in, which may be the national broadcast organization, or might be the leading news organization in your country. And because they're such easy devices to use, few people will probably change the default. So the built-in default news provider for that device will have a very significant additional power in that national market as well. So I think that's also something to watch, that more and more as we're getting these devices that kind of make a choice for us what kind of news we're getting, there's an algorithmic shaping of the news that we're getting as well. So that, I think, is also quite an important development. And I don't know how much people are really willing then to change default settings and really choose from whatever options are made available to them what news they might want to access.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Soy Camilo Zavala y soy periodista del medio deportivo emergente Panorama Deportivo.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, yep.
Hola, me llamo Aldo Torchiaro, soy un PhD candidate. May I speak English directly?
Sure.
Okay. I'm doing a PhD with the University of Rome, and we have an agreement with the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. And I'm a journalist as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm deeply concerned. So I thank you very much for such an impressive lecture and for your excursus. My first question is, are social media more affordable than traditional media for the hierarchy of news? Basically, who decide who's most important and less important? And who's behind the agenda setting of the news? Because you were mentioning it just now, what as a video or a pictures get immediately the priority on social media. Maybe there are many important news who has not video or an image, and they are actually important.
Yep, that's a really good question. Thank you. Yes, again, that's part of, I guess, that what I call the normalization of journalism into social media, because yes, social media logic is increasingly that visual content, video, photos, tend to get more shared and more retweeted and more liked and more commented upon than pure text content. That's been a shift over the last few years, that shift towards audiovisual content. The more journalism is being embedded into social media, the more it works by those logics perhaps as well. And I think that's why we're seeing also in journalistic practice more and more that journalists that are being trained now, of course, are being trained to do everything, to report in text, to shoot brief video, even just via their mobile phone or similar simple device, to record audio, to take photos and so on. So they are multi-instrumentalists, if you like. They're doing all sorts of forms of reporting at the same time in order to be able to have the content that is attractive enough beyond the text itself. So yes, absolutely. I think that's a really important part of that social media logic that is being, if you like, forced upon journalism increasingly. So that's I think one answer to your question. The other part, hang on, the first part of the question was.
Who's behind the agenda setting?
Yeah, sorry, yes, absolutely. And that's, I think, again, that's where the citizen part of this, the the much broader range of people who are engaging with the news via social media and actively engaging, not just as audiences, I think becomes important, because it is possible, of course, for issues to become visible that may not have been high on the agenda of professional journalists. It's possible for issues to be, again, crowdsourced to prominence, as Miraz and Papakarisi have said. I think we've seen this with issues like, let's say, the Me Too movement. We've seen this with issues like the Idle No More movement of indigenous people in North America. We've seen a number of these sorts of cases where particular issues that have not been high on the news agenda have risen to much greater prominence, because there have been ordinary people, maybe some celebrities and others, who have their own social media audiences who've pursued these when mainstream journalism was perhaps not that interested or didn't think that there was much to them. So yes, absolutely. That is again the role of social media as this sort of third space, this tertiary space that is neither owned by ordinary users nor by journalists. A different form of agenda setting can happen there. That's no longer controlled largely by news organizations and the key institutional actors that they report about. So I think that's a really important positive shift in many ways as well, because it does allow the rise of new themes that mainstream journalism may not necessarily have covered by itself.
Otra pregunta, comentario. Yo tengo... ¿Sí?
Hola, yo soy Fabiola Venegas. Estoy trabajando en estos momentos como freelance, como periodista de finanzas e innovación. Me gustaría saber qué elementos son claves hoy en día para que una estrategia comunicacional sea efectiva en redes sociales.
She's actually a freelancer journalist on finance and innovation, and she's interested, wondering in which kind of elements are today, according to your opinion, successful to do news in social media.
Okay, that's a really good question. It's a really important question for journalists as well, of course, who are in precarious roles and in freelance roles, for instance, and who are operating independently from news organizations. So I think being consistently active via social media tends to be important now, because that makes journalists visible, and building up an audience of your own, again, building up a personal brand of your own in this way tends to be important through this as well, because the more you are able to demonstrate to both a news organization that might want to hire you, that might want to pay for your work, or also to potential interviewees, to people that you're engaging with as part of the journalistic work, that you have a significant audience, that you are independently an important operator in a news environment as well, I think is important. So building up a personal following, building up a personal brand, being visible in your own right on social media is important. Covering your field, whatever it might be, consistently over time as well is important. Unfortunately, that also creates greater demands possibly on your time, because it means that you can't simply work from 9 to 5 and then switch off during the evenings, but it might mean that you're kind of constantly on, you're constantly connected, you're constantly updating. I think for freelancers, for independent journalists, one of the advantages that they actually have compared to journalists who work for a particular news organization is that they can engage more freely with others as well. So it is possible to become a news curator perhaps more easily than someone who works for a particular news organization. So if you're working for a particular organization, if you're working, let's say, for The Guardian, then you might be told that you should only ever retweet other Guardian reporters or other or share stories from The Guardian. Whereas if you're working independently, you can bring together stories that are relevant to your field from all sorts of sources, bring those together and curate a news feed, curate your own news feed with all of that information. And that will probably be quite valuable for the people who follow you. Because they can get all of that information then from your feed. They don't have to follow 10 different other journalists. They can simply follow you and get all of this. So I think there's a great opportunity there, particularly for freelancers, to really develop a personal curation practice, if you like. And that in itself might really be attractive to audiences in the end as well. We've actually done some work both in Australia and in Germany looking at what journalists share via social media, looking at some of the leading political journalists in each country to look at what they share via social media. And we've seen that in some cases, the journalists working for particular news outlets are rarely sharing anything that's not coming from their own institution, from their own news source. And in many ways, that's perfectly understandable, but is of less value to a follower of that journalist than a journalist who shares much more widely, independent of where it's coming from, who shares important breaking news and important news stories and analysis from a broad range of sources as well. So I think that's probably one of the things that freelancers or journalists working for news organizations that will allow this can do, that really sets them apart from others, and that ultimately positions them as a key source of information, a key connecting point in the network as well.
Yeah, hello, I am Andrea Oare. I work at the University of Chile, and I have a small question. Which news curation platforms or tools do you recommend to work with?
Well, at this point, I guess, obviously Twitter is still very much seen as a central platform. It's not the platform with the largest audience, obviously. It's in many ways an elite platform, a niche platform. But elite also means that it has some very powerful and influential people who use it. So I think Twitter is still very important. Facebook used to be more important, but it has recently changed its news algorithm, which means that its news feed algorithm, the feed on your personal profile, so that news content is less prominent now in what it displays in your profile. And in fact, news organizations have seen something like a 20% drop of readership coming in from Facebook to their platforms after that change. So Facebook is actually trying to actively position itself away from the news. That could change again very quickly because they can make these changes very easily, and they might find that people are perhaps even using Facebook less if there's less news on there. But Facebook is no longer is no longer quite so central. It's still important, but no longer quite so central. I'm interested in some of the other platforms that have emerged, obviously WhatsApp and Snapchat as well, and there's some interesting experiments that are happening there with news as well, but I think at this point there isn't enough research yet to really say exactly how widely that's been accepted, and to be honest, I simply don't know enough about the platforms being used in Chile either, because there are some real differences between different countries there as well, in which platforms have been adopted particularly prominently in different countries. There is also, and this goes back actually to that point about images and videos as well, there is quite a bit of experimentation with Instagram as well. If you have news that can be presented in a video or at least with an attractive image as well, then Instagram is also being used more and more. So these, to me, are still the kind of the core platforms, but this is shifting very clearly. The mix of platforms itself is shifting, no doubt, and which of these again are important in different countries is also quite different from country to country. The other thing that might be worth saying as well is for some news outlets, one way of actually getting people to come back to their site itself is to produce attractive live blogs. So blogs that on a particular story that might be unfolding as we speak, is pulling together all sorts of social media and other information from different sources and puts it into a live blog format. And that might actually be one of those ways that you can get people to come back to your own news site again too, because that's almost, again, a curated feed of information that, grabs some tweets from Donald Trump or whoever, grabs some images from Instagram, grabs some video from YouTube or whatever, and puts all of that together around that story. So it pulls all the different social media platforms together into a single feed that can be curated via the platform of the news organization itself. So that is, I think, that service is where the balance is between journalism logic and social media logic almost. It's kind of trying to do something that looks like social media, but do it on the platform of the news organization. I think that remains still quite an important format as well, that actually does genuinely bring people back to the news site as well. So I think we'll see that being used, and some news organizations, like, again, particularly The Guardian, BBC as well, are doing this very, very successfully around particularly breaking news stories, whether it's some natural disaster or an unfolding political crisis or whatever. So these might also be interesting models that journalism will continue to pursue.
¿Alguna otra pregunta, comentario? A mí me gustaría hacer una pregunta que tiene que ver con este perfil del News Curator. Cuando quería saber en Australia qué tipo de cambios organizacionales ha habido en las salas de prensa de los distintos medios para enfrentar los flujos de noticias que vienen de los contenidos generados por usuarios. My question is about which kind of organizational changes are coming inside the news press rooms and the media in Australia to work with content generated by users.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, Australia is an interesting case because we have a very concentrated news environment. Traditionally, we've had very few independent news organizations. We have the ABC, our public broadcaster. We have News Corp, which is the Murdoch organization, which runs a number of newspapers around the country, but they're very much integrated with each other. And we have Fairfax, which is the other newspaper chain, essentially. And these three really are the three major companies, and there's not much else. Historically, there's not been much else in the country. That's actually changed recently with the introduction of Australian versions of The Guardian, Huffington Post, BuzzFeed, and the Daily Mail. So that's been one of the changes, that more and more we've seen the arrival of international news brands into Australia doing online-only news. So that's been a very significant change to begin with. And with particularly those new entrants as well, they have been often quite active promoting their content via social media as well, where some of the other platforms, the traditional providers have not been that active. The ABC has been quite strong because as a public broadcaster also it's not so worried about revenue. And I think that's one of the big dividing lines as well. A public broadcaster that's funded by the government essentially can experiment with social media much more easily. It's not losing revenue. It doesn't have any revenue to lose in the first place. So it's able to open up to social media much more than certainly News Corp and Fairfax have done as commercial news organizations. So that's really been where a lot of the experimentation has been with either the new entrants coming in or with the ABC. What we've seen in Australia is that there's been a very significant adoption of Twitter, particularly amongst journalists, after some initial reluctance, and I had that quote there from Latika Berg saying, well, after the leadership change, which happened unexpectedly and which journalists really found out about because politicians were tweeting about it via Twitter, journalists suddenly started to realize that, well, we probably should be on Twitter to find out about these things and be able to report on them. And the journalists who were really had a very significant advantage in reporting about them as well. So we've seen those sorts of developments happen gradually. And in news organizations as well, we've seen then the hiring of social media reporters and social media editors and so on as well. Again, particularly with the ABC early on. So these are, again, not reporters who report about social media, but who are tasked with reporting via social media, on social media. And that's been an important shift. I wouldn't say that we've gone that much beyond this at this point. I think the full changeover in Australia still has to happen. Again, there isn't because it's such a market with such limited competition essentially between those three players traditionally. There's never been a big push to innovate. These three have arranged themselves quite comfortably in relation to each other. They've divided up the market, so there's no need for them to innovate. They have, a part of the market that they're almost guaranteed. It's been some of the new entrants that have shaken things up a little bit, particularly I would say The Guardian, which again, as a company that's not reliant on revenue, because it's funded by the Scott Trust, it's been able to innovate and run run losses to some extent. So its journalists have been very active also via social media, pushing information out via social media, also running live blogs and so on. So they have been, I think, they really have established Guardian Australia, particularly through its social media presence, rather than necessarily by the website itself. So that's, I think, been an important aspect of what's been going on as well. But I think Australia, for all of the genuine widespread use of social media, is not necessarily a great innovator. A lot of the innovation in journalism that we've seen in Australia has been imported from the UK or from the US as well.
Thank you. Bueno, si no hay más preguntas, quisiéramos agradecer al profesor nuevamente e invitarlos acá arriba, justo al primer piso, al lado de la escalera, a que tomemos un café. Así que muchas gracias por su asistencia. Thank you so much, Professor Bruns.
Thank you. Thanks.